Our presentation today focuses on lessons we've learned through our recent updates to the Regional Indicators Initiative, which is a program that tracks citywide performance indicators like energy use and greenhouse gas emissions for Minnesota cities. My name is Becky Alexander with LHB. I've been the primary researcher for this program for the past 10 years or so. I'll be starting with a quick overview of the program, then dive into the data trends that we're seeing, and leave you with some actionable ideas to continue reducing greenhouse gas emissions in your communities. Starting with some background, Minnesota's Next Generation Energy Act of 2007 sets statewide emissions reduction goals of 15% by 2015, 30% by 2025, and 80% by 2050 from 2005 levels. We missed our 2015 goal, and we're not likely to meet our 2025 goal without additional effort. So in addition to federal and statewide action, Minnesota needs its communities to help drive emissions reductions at the local scale. To support this need, the Green Step Cities program was developed, providing a list of best practices that cities could voluntarily take on to improve their community's sustainability. When this program was launched in 2010, it was set up to track which practices cities have adopted, but didn't have a method for tracking how effective these strategies are at moving the needle towards sustainability. The Regional Indicators Initiative was conceived as a way to fill this gap by tracking citywide performance metrics. And in fact, this helped contribute to the addition of Steps 4 and 5 to the Green Step Cities program about 5 years ago, which are very metrics-based. The Regional Indicators Initiative, or RII, tracks community-wide energy, water, travel, and waste data, and translates these into greenhouse gas emissions in accordance with the U.S. Community Protocol, which serves as a national standard to define which emission sources and activities should be included in a community-wide inventory, and it provides methodologies to account for these emissions. This protocol reflects the sources that local governments are best able to influence, including emissions that occur within the city's geographic boundaries, also known as Scope 1 emissions, as well as certain emissions that are occurring outside the community, also known as Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions. It's important to note that these are truly citywide metrics that reflect the decisions of local residents and businesses, not just city-owned buildings and fleets. For energy, this includes the electricity, gas, and other heating fuels that are used within the city boundaries, converted from kilowatt hours and therms into the common metric of British thermal units, or BTUs. A quick note on language, I'll be using gas here instead of natural gas in order to try to drop some of its connotations as inherently climate friendly, since the gas we use for heating is a fossil fuel that's actually comprised primarily of methane, which is a potent greenhouse gas. So gas and other heating fuels like propane, coal, and wood release emissions where they're burned, typically inside buildings within city boundaries, while electricity releases emissions from the combustion of other fuels where it's generated, which is often outside of the city's geographic boundaries. But all of these sources are included here. We get aggregated energy data from energy utilities broken out between residential and non-residential uses. Most cities are served by more than one energy utility, with some cities served by up to 5. The water data includes potable water used citywide from the municipal water supply, excluding other water permit holders like large industries. This is provided by the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources and is broken out by sector. Emissions associated with the water sector include the energy used to treat and distribute potable water. But since these are already accounted for in the energy sector, we don't report water-associated emissions separately through RII. Additionally, since many of our funding sources have prioritized greenhouse gas emissions, we only have water data through 2013 for most cities available on the website, and we won't be examining water use trends during this presentation. Travel data includes vehicle miles traveled within each city's geographic boundaries, as reported by the Minnesota Department of Transportation. This in-boundary method has different results than an origin-destination method would, which assigns miles to the city where a trip starts and ends rather than to each city it passes through. So again, RI uses vehicle miles traveled within the city's geographic boundaries. And for vehicles with internal combustion engines, emissions occur on the road as the motor fuels are burned. Waste data includes the municipal solid waste generated within city boundaries, broken out into recycling, landfilling, and incineration. And since consistent waste data is only available at the county scale in Minnesota through the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency's SCORE reports, it's assigned to each city based on the city's percentage of the county's population, so it isn't as precise as the other metrics. Waste emissions occur where the waste is managed, which is typically outside city boundaries. In waste-to-energy applications, emissions are released when the waste is burned. In landfills, emissions, primarily methane, are released over time as organic materials break down. And landfills with methane capture systems release less methane into the atmosphere than landfills without these systems. The greenhouse gas emissions from each of these primary metrics are reported in metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents, which accounts for the relative heat trapping potential of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. Emissions that would have occurred naturally, say if a piece of wood furniture had decomposed out in a forest rather than in a landfill, are deemed to be biogenic and are excluded from the totals in accordance with the U.S. Community Protocol. On the Regional Indicators website, you can look at citywide totals, or you can normalize by population, households, or jobs. And for the data analysis our team has done for this presentation, we also take a look at other factors like weather and housing characteristics. So RII started by collecting 2008 through 2010 data for 3 pilot cities. And after determining that this type of information could indeed be collected at the city scale in Minnesota, we expanded the program to provide 2007 through 2013 data for about 20 cities, and have continued adding batches of cities and new years as funding comes in. So now we have at least 1 year of complete data for 72 Minnesota cities, representing nearly half of the state's population. The cities are located across the state. They include various city types, from urban cores to suburban bedroom communities to rural centers, and range in size from under 500 people to over 400,000. While a handful of these cities have independently contacted us and self-funded their data collection, the bulk of this work has been funded through state and federal agencies, which have prioritized including cities that have shown their commitment to sustainability through their involvement in the Green Step Cities program. Our most recent work, which has been funded through the Department of Commerce, included gathering data through 2020 for all Green Step cities that were at step 4 or higher when the project started in September of 2021. We were able to obtain complete data for 2020, shown in bold, for nearly all of the cities in that group, and are still hoping to get data for the final few once we confirm the data privacy of individual customers is being protected. We'll be sharing some lessons learned from an analysis of these 31 cities shown here, which represent about a quarter of the state's population. We'll also be looking at some trends over time for the 18 cities that have complete data back to 2007, representing about 20% of the state's population. If your city isn't on the list or not on the website at all, and you'd like to know what it would take to be included or updated, feel free to reach out and we can take a look. Over the years, we have attempted to collect data for more cities than are shown here, and though getting travel and waste data is relatively straightforward, it has been challenging to get complete energy data, since this involves making individual requests to each utility company, which of course have different capacities for aggregating the data in this way. To date, we've received energy data from over 60 different energy utilities, and the ones that we've worked with since the beginning have really streamlined the process to improve their efficiency and consistency in responding to these requests. Our dream is to have all utilities publicly reporting city-scale energy data, much like Excel is now doing in their community energy reports. We also hope to expand RII to include all cities and counties in Minnesota, along with Native nations. Okay, so let's dig into the findings. One thing that is relatively consistent between cities and over time is that the energy used in our buildings is the greatest contributor to emissions. So prioritizing strategies like efficiency and clean energy is important. I'll note here that different types of inventories break things down in slightly different ways, so you'll often see electricity being reported separately from gas. The US Community Protocol bundles all energy used in the built environment into one category, since this can be addressed through similar strategies. As a quick side note, looking at the entire community is really important. We don't typically separate out the emissions from city operations, basically local government buildings and fleets plus municipal water infrastructure. But we have worked with several cities that have done this as part of their climate action planning efforts and found them to represent less than 2% of the community total. Minnesota cities have historically been leaders at actions like improving municipal building efficiency and adding solar panels to City Hall. And these actions can certainly demonstrate leadership in a way that has a ripple effect through the community. But we're now seeing local governments working to expand the adoption of these strategies to have a bigger impact. Okay, so back to how emissions break down by sector. This pie chart looks slightly different for each city, but most cities fall into the 50 to 70% range for energy. And if we look at how the energy emissions break down between commercial, industrial, and residential uses, we can get some additional insight into this variation. Few cities, like Hutchinson, Northfield, and Falcon Heights on the left side of the graph, have large industries or universities and relatively little pass-through traffic, meaning that over 80% of their emissions come from building energy. At the other end of the scale, we have Nisswa, which is largely a residential community with a lot of vacation homes and a state highway that's heavily used as a truck route and for Twin Cities residents traveling to cabins. This results in nearly 60% of its emissions coming from travel, remembering that for RII, travel is assigned to the city in which it occurs, regardless of where that trip starts or ends. This variation that we see from city to city is one reason that we're continuing this model of collecting city-specific data. If all cities looked the same, we'd be able to just recommend a set of strategies that would be high impact for everyone. But this approach enables cities to prioritize their efforts based on their own biggest areas of opportunity. You may be noticing one other outlier city here. Mahtomedi has a disproportionately large share of its emissions coming from residential energy use. So does this mean that its housing stock is less efficient than other cities? Well, not necessarily. I'm going to switch from comparing the percentage of emissions to just looking at overall emissions per capita, or per person living in the city. So this is now reordered from the lowest emissions per capita to the highest, and we see Mahtomedi is at the far left. And now we can see that their residential emissions are more or less in line with other cities. It just has such low emissions in every other area that the residential emissions are the biggest piece of their pie. Overall, emissions per capita varies across these cities with a median of around 10 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per capita. And just as a reminder, this generally isn't accounting for activities like agriculture, which typically occurs outside of city boundaries. So the statewide average is actually 25 tons per capita, which accounts for the higher per capita rates in rural areas that are exporting food and products. In contrast to that, the global average is around 5.5 tons per capita, And in order to have a shot at keeping the average global temperature increase below 1.5 degrees Celsius, we need to get to under 3 tons per capita globally by 2030. Now, we always like to emphasize that the best use of this information is for a city to understand its own emissions profile and track its own progress over time. There are just too many reasons that comparing yourself to other cities may not be productive. Although we can use normalizations like dividing the total emissions by the number of residents to at least get all cities to show up on the same graph, this normalization isn't accounting for other factors. For example, a city like St. Anthony Village has very little pass-through traffic compared to a city like Golden Valley, which is bordered by an interstate and 2 major highways. Travel data is also impacted by where the line is drawn for roads that border 2 different cities. So for example, while 694 borders both Matamidi and Oakdale, the emissions along that stretch are assigned entirely to Oakdale. Cities like Rochester and Bloomington have large influxes of visitors coming to Destination Medical Center and the Mall of America. Cities like Northfield and Hutchinson have energy-intensive industries that support the local economy and produce things that are used in other cities and states. And unfortunately, there are some inconsistencies in the data provided by energy utilities that limit comparisons between cities. So utilities are required to protect the privacy of individual customer data, but don't have a standardized approach to this. Xcel Energy removes data from any customer that comprises 15% or more of the total energy use. And this actually impacts the commercial and industrial emissions for 10 of the cities shown here. For example, Matamidi's data, which looks so low, actually excludes the 3 largest electricity customers and the 2 largest gas customers in the city. And at the other end of the spectrum, the Hutchinson Utilities Commission doesn't exclude any customer data. So we're engaged in ongoing conversations with utilities, the Public Utilities Commission, which has an open docket on this topic, and other data users to try to address this issue and strike the best balance between privacy and usefulness of this information for climate planning and action. So feel free to reach out to me directly if you have any questions about it. But with all that in mind, it probably doesn't make much sense to compare emissions rates between specific cities. However, we have looked across cities to try to determine some general trends that might be useful. For example, we see that travel emissions are highest in suburban areas, which tend to involve more commuter traffic and are often more car dependent than urban centers. So strategies that support walking, biking, and transit in these areas can make a big difference. Moving over to energy use, we see that residential emissions are lowest in urban areas. And we actually dug into this a little bit more with an analysis of residential energy use. So now we're looking at BTUs of energy rather than tons of greenhouse gas emissions. We also switched to 2019 data for this analysis in order to avoid the energy impacts of people working from home during the pandemic. Okay, so here we see that the median residential energy usage is about 100 million BTUs per household, with a range from 78 to 196. Isaac Johnson on our team did a statistical analysis to see if we could determine any main drivers for the variation we see between cities, looking at 4 main categories: density, weather, utility providers, and housing characteristics, such as type, age, size, primary heating fuel, and the percentage of housing units that are owner-occupied versus renter-occupied. So this graph is showing total energy use, but we also looked at electricity and gas independently. We found that the combination of all of these variables were really good predictors of household energy use. R-squared values above 0.99 for the stats folks out there. And for the non-stats folks, the closer that value is to 1, the better it is at predicting household energy. Taken individually, the strongest correlations were with housing type and ownership. So cities with more single-family detached homes used more energy than cities with higher proportions of townhomes and apartments. This makes sense as single-family homes tend to be larger than other housing types and they have greater surface area exposed to the hot or cold air outside. Home ownership also had a strong correlation. Cities with more owner-occupied housing used more energy than cities with higher rates of renters. We're hypothesizing that this is related to the difference in home type and size, as well as household income in owner-occupied homes versus renter-occupied homes. One variable that was not strongly correlated was the age of the houses. We assumed that new homes would be more efficient, but if anything, cities with more new homes are using more energy than cities with older homes. It seems that the increased size of new homes may be outpacing any gains that we've seen in the energy code. So strategies that improve the energy efficiency of new homes could be impactful, especially for growing cities. And finally, we found that cities with higher percentages of electric heating tend to use less energy, which is something we'll revisit later in the presentation. So that wraps up the analysis of 2020 data. But I mentioned earlier that one of the best uses of this data set is to track progress over time. So let's take a look at how things have changed since 2007. We're now looking at total annual emissions from the 18 cities with complete data from 2007 through 2020. We see that greenhouse gas emissions have decreased by over 30% since 2007, actually meeting the state's 2025 goal. And since our population has continued to grow, this equates to a 41% reduction in per capita emissions. However, you may be remembering that 2020 was a bit of an odd year. Many people stopped driving into work, a lot of work slowed considerably or stopped altogether. As we transition into living with COVID, we have the opportunity to establish new habits, so let's make sure they have the impact we want on emissions. It's also important to note that we've been able to decarbonize our cities more quickly than our state as a whole, which had only achieved a 5% reduction from 2007 levels in 2018 compared to our 15% reduction. So this is likely due to things like agriculture, where we've not yet seen meaningful and sustained reductions. So cities really need to be exceeding the state's goals by even more to give us a shot at meeting them. Let's look at how well the individual cities match this overall trend. Here we're looking at the percent change in overall emissions from 2007 for each of the 18 cities. So they all start at 0% in 2007, then go up or down from there. And we see that many of the cities have a similar overall trend, but that they vary in magnitude. From Elk River, which achieved a 19% reduction from 2007 to 2020, to Bloomington, which achieved a 42% reduction. So this is reinforcing our conviction that wherever possible, cities should be using their own data to track progress rather than relying on statewide averages. If we look at each emissions source separately, we see that the electricity sector has achieved dramatic reductions, over 50%. Gas has increased overall, though with a lot of dips and jumps over time. Travel remained relatively flat until the 20% drop during the pandemic in 2020. And waste, though too small to see at this scale, varied quite a bit, but was 11% lower in 2020 than in 2007. This graphic also gives a sense of the relative breakdown in energy by type and sector. So the commercial and industrial sector has more emissions from electricity than from gas, while the opposite is now true for the residential sector. You can also see that to meaningfully impact gas emissions, we'll need to act across sectors, since there's pretty close to a 50-50 split between homes and businesses. So looking in more detail at that reduction in electricity emissions, we found that it's due to a combination of reducing electricity use by 14% and using electricity that is 46% cleaner. Minnesota's clean energy standards and the efficiency and decarbonization efforts of our electric utilities have been instrumental in these changes. The state's renewable energy standard requires utilities to provide 25% of their electricity from renewable sources by 2025. And while the majority of these savings have already been achieved, multiple utilities have committed to 100% carbon-free electricity. For example, Xcel Energy and Minnesota Power both aim to provide 100% carbon-free electricity by 2050, with 80% reduction goals by 2030 and 2035, respectively. And Moorhead Public Service obtained 80% of its electricity from carbon-free sources in 2021, then used renewable energy credits to get to 100%. The rate of clean energy adoption to date varies across the state, so some cities are getting electricity that is half as carbon intensive as other cities. For utilities that don't report their emissions factors, we use the regional average from the U.S. Energy Information Administration, which is the gray line shown here. So cities that get their electricity from more carbon-intensive sources may want to invest in local renewable energy, which can have economic benefits as well. We are seeing residents, businesses, and local governments also contributing to a cleaner grid by helping fund new utility-scale wind and solar through green power purchase programs, by supporting smaller-scale community solar gardens, and by installing local renewable energy. This example of Northfield includes several of their largest businesses and institutions participating in Xcel's WindSource program, which provides them with renewable energy credits in exchange for their investment in new wind energy in Minnesota. The 3% from on-site renewables shows the impact of the local wind turbines used by Carleton and St. Olaf colleges. So there is a lot of progress being made to reduce the carbon intensity of our electricity, which opens the door to the beneficial electrification of space heating and vehicle travel. But in order to electrify at the scale needed, we'll also need to reduce our energy loads. So let's take a look at how successfully we've been doing this in RII cities. We saw that the overall electricity use has decreased by 14%. If we explore how that breaks down by sector, we see that non-residential electricity has been steadily decreasing, while residential electricity has been pretty flat. We can also speculate that there was some shift from the commercial sector to the residential sector in 2020 due to the increase in working from home caused by the pandemic. Since the population and economic activity in these cities has been increasing over time, the electricity per person and per job has been dropping more steeply than shown here. Looking at gas, this is much more variable from year to year, but we are seeing an upward trend for non-residential gas use. So let's see how the individual cities deviate from these totals. We'll start with residential gas, which we've normalized per household. You can see that nearly all of the cities have a similar pattern of change since 2007. And if you'll allow me just a brief tangent here, I'll note that our initial data set about 10 years ago was just 2008 through 2010 data. And man, we thought we were doing a great job at reducing energy use. When we saw the increase in 2011, we thought it could be because we were coming out of a recession. But now, with all of these years of data, it's clear that something else is in play. So for gas specifically, it's pretty critical to see the data for each year, since just looking at a single year or even every 5 years could be very misleading about your trends. Okay, so back to this mountain range of energy use. I'm sure many of you have guessed the cause. It's weather. If we graph the change in heating degree days over the top, this becomes obvious. Heating degree days are a measure of how much lower the average daily temperature is than a standard 65-degree set point. So the higher the number, the more heating energy you'd expect to use. But this dependency on the weather makes us vulnerable. especially those with lower incomes. Many people can't afford a utility bill that's 20% higher than the previous year, and that's without even accounting for price increases. And if our energy supply is cut off due to a major weather event during a cold spell, many of our homes won't be livable for more than a few days. So the work needs to be done to weatherize our homes, adding the insulation, high-performance windows, and air sealing needed to tamp down this weather dependency. We can also electrify our homes. By switching to heat pumps, we can achieve efficiencies that are 3 times higher than a top-of-the-line gas furnace, since heat pumps are just moving heat rather than creating it. Residential electricity is also impacted by the weather, this time due to air conditioning for cooling rather than space heating, but to a much lesser extent than gas. So a 30% drop in cooling degree days from 2007 to 2008 only saw a 5% drop in electricity use, which makes sense because of the many other appliances and devices that use electricity in the home. But weatherizing homes is also critical to health and safety during summer months, as we expect to see more days above 95 degrees in the coming years. Since electricity use is dropping more than would be expected based on weather patterns, this suggests that homes are getting more efficient in their electricity use. This is likely due to the adoption of LEDs and more efficient appliances and devices, often through participation in conservation improvement programs offered by utilities, which incentivize energy efficiency. Okay, switching over to non-residential electricity use, we see slightly more variation by city and less weather dependence, but there have been substantial decreases in most cities, with a median decrease of nearly 20% from 2007 to 2020. Like with home electricity use, we can guess that much of these savings are coming from switching to LED lighting, along with participation in other conservation improvement programs. In office buildings, the shift from desktop computers to laptop computers also had a large impact. And recent citywide energy benchmarking ordinances for commercial buildings, like those in Minneapolis, St. Paul, St. Louis Park, and Edina, are helping building owners better understand their energy use and act to achieve savings. On the other hand, non-residential gas use has increased over time for most cities, with a median increase of 5%. This is also weather dependent, but while homes can typically address weather with strategies to improve the walls and roof, there can be other factors in play for commercial and industrial buildings, like dock doors that are open in cold weather, high ventilation rates that may or may not recover waste heat from that exhausted air, or even malfunctioning economizers that aren't properly leveraging outdoor air for free space conditioning. So for these, we'd advise a building-specific approach to improving efficiency, which can be diagnosed through a process called commissioning. We do see that the increase in gas use over time is true even when normalizing for weather. So that's shown here as the change in non-residential gas use per heating degree day. Only 3 cities, Falcon Heights, St. Paul, and St. Louis Park, achieved sustained reductions. All others stayed flat or increased. And this graph doesn't look much different if we normalize by the number of jobs in each city, which is the best proxy for GDP that we could find at the city scale. Though I'm not sure why exactly non-residential gas use is increasing, it does make sense that we haven't seen major decreases, like with electricity. While an LED is 75% more efficient than its predecessors, it's just not possible for gas equipment to achieve these same numbers. So a gas furnace replacement might increase its efficiency by 10%. So we need to be investing in electric heating technologies, which can achieve much higher efficiencies. This data set also points to the need to better tune building operations to meet the needs of the users. 2020 presented a unique opportunity to reduce the energy used in commercial buildings based on the number of jobs lost and people working from home. But we didn't see this happen in most cities. This could be because we only have half a winter of pandemic data here, but I would also guess that building operators weren't making major changes based on occupancy rates. to how they're heating their spaces. As we find our new normal in commercial buildings, new construction and renovation projects may want to explore approaches for personal thermal comfort through heating and cooling chairs or wristbands, or systems like chilled beams that enable more control zones to be used. In any case, I really hope we stop using the same amount of energy to heat an office space serving 5 people as we did for 95 people. All right, zooming back out to the big picture, we've seen that actions taken by local governments, residents, businesses, and energy utilities have moved the needle for citywide electricity over the past 15 years. However, our gas use is high, very dependent on changes in the weather, and has not seen the same efficiency gains. If we switch back to GHG emissions rather than BTUs of energy, we see that although electricity was the larger contributor to emissions back in 2007, the progress being made there has brought it to the same level as gas. Gas, of course, has not been getting cleaner and isn't able to get cleaner to the same extent as electricity is. So moving forward, we'll need to continue working toward carbon-free electricity while also making a big push to shift heating, cooking, and process loads to use electricity. This can also involve utilizing district heating and cooling systems. District Energy St. Paul has a goal to be carbon neutral by 2050 and is exploring technologies like using the aquifer to store thermal energy removed from buildings during the summer to provide heat during the winter. Moving on to vehicle travel. So prior to the pandemic, VMT, vehicle miles traveled, stayed within 5% or so of its 2007 values, while the carbon intensity of each mile traveled decreased slightly as vehicles got replaced with more fuel-efficient models and the use of biodiesel increased. This combination caused travel emissions to decline slightly through 2019. And then, of course, in 2020, VMT and emissions dropped by about 20% with the reduction in commuter traffic during the pandemic. But the big question is how much of this 2020 reduction will be sustained as we find our new normal? Well, recently released 2021 data shows that vehicle miles traveled rebounded by about 40% of what was lost, which likely reflects the continued prevalence of remote working. We'll of course need to see another few years of data to understand the extent to which these new travel patterns will hold. But in any case, in order to meet our GHG reduction goals, we need to find a way to achieve a sustained reduction of vehicle travel, and we need to rapidly adopt electric vehicles for the remaining trips. These gradual improvements in fuel economy aren't getting us there fast enough. If we look at the trends for individual cities, they're pretty varied, though with the same general shape as the overall trend line in recent years. In 2019, the median city had increased vehicle miles traveled by 5% from 2007. Some of the increases in VMT are likely due to city growth. The top 2 cities, Rochester and Woodbury, grew significantly during this time period, but there are a few cities that reduced their VMT despite growing, like White Bear Lake. I will note that some of the more drastic changes, like Bloomington from 2009 to 2010 at the bottom of the graph, are actually due to shifts in road categorizations or methodological changes in the data, rather than actual shifts in traffic. Moving on to waste, we see an overall increase in the waste being disposed over this time period, which is true even if we normalize to account for population growth. However, due to an increase in recycling rates, the emissions per ton of waste disposed has decreased, leading to an 11% drop in emissions from waste management. To achieve higher reduction rates, we'll need to focus on waste reduction, in addition to continuing to increase recycling rates. So how do waste emissions vary by city? Well, as I mentioned earlier, our waste data is at the county scale rather than the city scale. So here we have the waste-related emissions per capita for each county with 1 or more cities in our data set. This data is quite a bit more varied than the others we've seen, both between communities and over time. though all but one of the counties do show an overall drop in waste emissions per capita since 2007. This variation primarily reflects the amount of municipal solid waste disposed, but it also reflects where the waste is sent, whether it's to an incineration facility, a landfill with or without methane recovery, or a recycling facility, which is assigned 0 emissions in the waste sector per the U.S. Community Protocol. And unfortunately, since we don't have access to consistent citywide data, it's a little bit more difficult here to track the impacts of local programs. The increase in recycling, along with a corresponding decrease in landfilling, is more obvious if we look at how the aggregated data for our 18 cities breaks down by management method over time, which is what's shown here. This data does come with the caveat that there were several methodological changes during this time period in how recycling data is reported, such as the inclusion of yard waste starting in 2016. So some of the earlier years are likely underestimates for recycling. That's what I have for you today in terms of the data. Hope that you enjoyed all those graphs. You can explore the data more through the Regional Indicators website. So you can use the city summary page, which is showing up here, to find metrics over time for individual cities. You can hover over the data points to get more information. You can isolate certain trends and explore in a lot of different ways. You can also use the energy, travel, water, waste, and greenhouse gas emissions pages to see how cities compare to each other. So we'll just take a quick look at energy here. This is looking at all of the cities with 2020 energy. We can see how that breaks down by electricity, gas, and other. Look just at residential energy use per household per day and see if we can find anything interesting there. So all this and more at regionalindicatorsmn.com. Let's talk a little bit about how cities are using this information. Many are using it to set emissions goals or maybe to understand the goals that they've already set. The Minnesota Pollution Control Agency has created a searchable database of community goals, the Minnesota Sustainability Index. This slide shows the 26 cities currently listed, all of which are RII participants. These communities have committed to goals as aggressive as carbon neutral by 2040 and 100% renewable electricity by 2030. In addition to 3 of the state's largest cities, this list includes the 1,500-person city of Grand Marais, which is in the northeastern corner of the state and doesn't have access to gas infrastructure. They're driven not just by the urgency of climate mitigation, but also by the need for energy resilience. Many of these cities are also using this type of data in their planning processes. So this slide shows Minnesota cities that have produced a climate action plan, energy action plan, and/or adaptation or resilience plan. Many of these plans use the community's baseline emissions to identify opportunities for high impact change. Several communities have gone a step beyond this by looking at their future emissions. We've worked with St. Louis Park, Eden Prairie, Northfield, and Hennepin County to forecast their business as usual trajectory, the top line in this graph, and explore different scenarios for achieving their goals. So this is the scenario that Hennepin County landed on for their recent climate action plan. In fact, any city with at least 3 years of complete energy data can explore potential energy futures using the interactive wedge diagram tool on our website. This forecasts city-specific energy emissions through 2040 and enables cities to test how different strategies impact their ability to meet their goals. So users can turn different strategies off and on, adjust the compliance rates or participation rates in the strategies, and even play around with the timeline to see what type of difference it would make to implement some of these today versus 10 years from now. Both St. Louis Park and Eden Prairie have also been tracking their progress in reference to their wedge diagrams. The white dots show data updates, and I love St. Louis Parks because it magically lands right on the goal line. in 2020. And as we've seen today, this is due to a combination of local action, weather, and pandemic impacts. But they can look at this information each year to see where they might need to adjust their implementation strategy and might choose to update the entire wedge diagram every 5 years or so to reflect their progress and any changes in external factors. And of course, many more cities are tracking their progress by examining their RII data each year and reporting to Green Step cities through steps 4 and 5. Another way of tracking progress is to do a more formal analysis of the drivers of change within your community. This requires several additional data points, like monthly energy data, and can quantify how much emissions would be expected to go up or down due to factors like city growth, weather, the carbon intensity of your energy mix, and energy and travel efficiency changes. This can also be a useful way to start to isolate the impacts of programs and policies from the many other variables impacting emissions. This is something that we've done for Hennepin County and for St. Louis Park. And so we're seeing trends related to community growth impacting emissions increases, while things like cleaner electricity and reductions in commercial electricity use driving reductions. I'd like to close out with a series of calls to action for local governments and community members. The first is to take high impact action. We have a pretty good idea of what needs to happen in order to meet our climate goals, and this work becomes more urgent every single day. So, even though it pains me to say this as a data nerd, don't feel like you need the latest data or the perfect plan before you can act. You can act now to electrify buildings. In addition to transitioning to heat pumps for space and water heating and induction cooktops in existing homes and businesses, we need to stop installing new gas equipment. This type of equipment in buildings is typically a 20 to 50 year investment, so what we install today is not likely to be replaced by 2050. Moving away from gas will also have major health benefits. UCLA researchers found that after cooking for an hour with gas appliances, the level of nitrogen dioxide in the home rose so high that it would be illegal if measured outside, which obviously can cause major respiratory issues. And of course, the health risks are higher for people who face other systemic disadvantages, those living in smaller apartments, without adequate ventilation, or without reliable healthcare access. Ideally, the shift to electrify buildings will be accompanied by other efficiency and resilience improvements, like improving the insulation and air sealing in homes in order to make them less vulnerable to changes in weather. Do this for low-income households first, as these are the most vulnerable to extreme weather. You can also act now to reduce reliance on vehicle travel by re-examining zoning patterns and regulations to encourage closer proximity between residents and businesses, by supporting public transportation, and by implementing complete streets that support pedestrian and bike infrastructure. Strategies like adding more trees can encourage more walking, increase economic activity, improve air quality, reduce urban heat, and sequester carbon. And then for the vehicle trips that are still needed, support the rapid adoption of electric vehicles by ensuring adequate charging infrastructure and ensure equitable access to EVs by supporting things like affordable car share programs. So local governments can take action on these items in a variety of ways, both independently and with other partners. At one end of the scale, cities can demonstrate leadership by doing things like installing solar and adopting net zero energy standards for public buildings, or transitioning their vehicle fleet to electric. This level of action may not be that impactful by itself, but can help set the stage for expanding these strategies into the private sector through education, encouragement, and incentives, which can take the form of connecting local residents and businesses with utility rebate programs or other financial resources, or offering technical assistance or expedited permitting. We're expecting a lot of rebates and tax credits to become available through the recently passed Inflation Reduction Act for things like weatherization, heat pumps, rooftop solar, and EVs. The The most impactful actions are typically achieved through regulation, such as sustainable building policies, benchmarking ordinances, or EV infrastructure requirements. In addition to the regulatory tools available to local governments, you can also advocate for statewide policy changes. We've seen that state and federal policies can effectively drive change, from federal appliance standards to statewide policies like clean electricity standards, the Conservation Improvement Program requirements, and biofuel mandates. State and federal policies or funding could advance clean energy, more impactful energy codes for both commercial and residential new construction, large-scale investment in building electrification and electric vehicles, and even the institutionalization of data collection efforts like this one by setting up systems to streamline community-scale energy data reporting and ensuring funding is available for ongoing data collection. So those are all things that any city or resident can take on, but you can also leverage city-specific opportunities that you find by either looking at your data, doing scenario planning, or simply through your knowledge of your community. For example, cities that expect a lot of new development in the coming decade can ensure that zoning and planning approvals prioritize higher density housing, mixed-use areas, and transit-oriented development. They can also implement a sustainable building policy to achieve better energy efficiency and local renewable energy development than is required by code. Cities served by a utility that doesn't plan to transition to carbon-free electricity can invest in more local renewables, or perhaps enter a partnership with its utilities to meet its goals. Cities that host large institutions or industries can work together on these topics. Northfield's Climate Action Plan has been tied into coursework at Carleton and St. Olaf colleges. In Morris, agricultural residues are used as an energy source. And concentrated areas with diverse heating and cooling loads can share their waste heat through district energy systems. Cities with a large percentage of a specific building type, whether restaurants, manufactured homes, or something else, can target programs to these buildings. And nearly every city will have local people with specialized knowledge, connections, and passion that can be transformative. Northfield's climate action planning process involved focus groups with the local Latinx community, business leaders, and high school and college students. And climate action in several other Minnesota communities has been accelerated by high schoolers participating in the I Matter program. And I know I said you don't have to have a plan to take action, but it is a good idea to document some of your decisions in order to commit to priorities, to understand who needs to be involved, and to provide a way to hold yourselves accountable. LHB has partnered with Abby Finnis, now of Local Climate Solutions, on several types of plans for Minnesota communities. They can take the form of an in-depth climate action plan that looks 20 to 30 years into the future and may involve a robust community engagement effort. Or it could be more of a climate action work plan that focuses on high-impact strategies that can be completed over the next few years and updated as progress is made, like Red Wing has done. Or it could even just be a to-do list that gets updated annually with high-impact actions gathered from Green Step Cities, this presentation, or other resources. And not every city needs its own plan. Any of these types of plans can be developed at the regional scale as well, like the work being done in Central and South Central Minnesota through the Region 5 and Region 9 development commissions. Hennepin County is also playing a leadership role in climate action, providing resources related to benchmarking ordinances and sustainable building policies that other units of government can utilize. Whichever type and scale of planning you use, please don't skip the step of addressing equity. Ask yourself, how are the costs and benefits of your actions being distributed across the community? Finally, track your progress. There are a lot of different variables in play, and it's easy to assume that your actions will make a difference. Prove it and adjust your approach accordingly. Thank you so much for your time, your attention, and your climate action. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions or if you are hoping to get involved.